Hey everyone, this is Tripp, and I'm here with my friend Sarey, and we're going to talk about a movie. That's right, and talking about a movie about Cabrini, a Catholic saint, Italian immigrant, and such a uh, in right in the middle of International Women's Day on the release. It seemed kind of dumb for me to talk about it without, like, if you have a filmmaker theologian in your Rolodex, you text them and say, "Can we talk about this movie together?" So thank you, Sari, for joining me to talk about this.
Thank you for having me. I think this should be a regular thing, though. I think we should be the Siskel and Ebert of the progressive theological world. That would be super fun.
There you go. I mean, it's not hard to talk me into giving me reasons to hang out with friends is not difficult. So, well, but here's the place to start. Like, I think this film, so much of its promotion is driven towards faith communities, and often the ones that I don't think we're not the ones we would end up hanging out with at church on Sunday. So
Yeah.
when in watching this film, and you just have on that filmmaker hat, right? Not going into it with like, is it going to get creepy religious? Is it going to like have subtle ideologies behind it and things? But like as someone that spends time thinking about film, both creating it and engaging it, what were you surprised by?
I was surprised by the production quality a little bit. Usually these faith-based films, it's not impressive. It's very like bright and there's not a lot of nuance going on. And they definitely took a swing at that. I think probably if you're like a real strong film nerd, this movie doesn't measure up to like whatever the top tier Hollywood films. But in terms of like movies coming from this world, it is it is top tier. It is people would say this is cinematic. This looks like a regular movie, not like if you turn on, if you're going through the radio stations and you get to the Christian radio station, you know it within a millisecond that it's a
Uh-huh.
Christian song. And the Christian movies can be like that too. This one, it might take you a while to figure it out. That being said, it's a little too pretty. There's this real weird, tension when you're depicting very horrible things
Mhm.
on screen, and if it looks like, too beautiful. Like Cabrini finding children in the sewers, and there's just a beautiful angelic light coming through from the street level onto this, like, little girl's face. I'm like, "Well, that doesn't seem like she needs rescuing. That little sewer house looks kinda nice?" So, I mean, I it's like there's not, like, any real grittiness, even though the things she's dealing with are horrifying and horrible, the way the children are treated in New York around that time and the orphans having nowhere to go and living in the sewers and having it worse than rats, as she says. Um, it sure looks pretty beautiful. So in a filmmaker lens, uh, like, it looks pretty, but maybe a little too pretty is
Mhm.
is where I'm at on it. Performances too, I think we're especially when it comes to the movies coming from this realm, we're stronger. And so you can instantly pick that out as a faith-based film. So
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think the other film that comes to mind of going to New York around that time period is Gangs of New York,
yes, mhm,
right? And was that's just a very different aesthetic.
it is. It definitely is.
But the to me, one of the fascinating things is doing this kind of biopic on someone who is a saint.
Yeah,
Because the whole yes, there's this process of canonization within the life of the church, and you could, like, spend time, like, nuancing and how does it work and things, but part of of identifying someone as a saint, is to point that the life of this person, is a window to understanding what what the presence and enactment of the divine looks like, um, in in different lives, right? Like, we obviously as Christians, you're like, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He makes material in his own living,
yeah,
the desire, dreams, embodiment of God. And saints are kind of like echoes of what it looks like for God to get dirty
Mhm.
in other bodies and in other places. And I think that the choosing an Italian immigrant at this time in America and addressing the kind of the kind of cultural crises and social and economic crises that the pressure of immigration put on New York at that time
Mhm.
is is oddly like an invitation for us to think about those kinds of questions today. Obviously not with Italians, um,
Mhm. Yeah.
but like this is what saintliness looks like,
Yeah.
when recognizing the need of the other,
Yeah.
across cultural differences. Um, that part of it was the most compelling, to me.
Yeah, yeah. I never heard it put exactly that way in terms of canonization. It's always been as someone who's been fully immersed in Protestantism, for most of my life, that idea was like sort of weird and trippy, especially when I found out that you had to perform 3 miracles and they could happen after you died, which I always thought was like pretty magical and and kind of fun, kind of a fun idea. Of course, after watching this movie, I looked up what were her miracles, which is always a fun thing. But yeah, that's a really beautiful question, and it's interesting because the filmmaker, I mean, we can get more into this later, but like, the filmmaker is Mexican and wanted to tell an immigrant story. There's no question that this woman deserved a biopic,
Mhm,
and especially doing all that she did with her life at a time when there was so much against her in so many ways is phenomenal. It's insane. It's incomprehensible, So yeah, I mean, that for me was really compelling too. I have thought about, you know, women and especially and minority women have been doing this shit for all time.
mhm,
And you see it in the New Testament, which is cool. Like there's just a little line here and there where you're like, oh, there's this bomb ass woman who's like an entrepreneur who's like supporting this like secret, like this illegal activity, and that's, like, so rad to think about. I had this idea once that I was like, I don't know, I think I was fired up one day, and I was like, "I'm just gonna do one of those things where I start, like, a fake denomination," or not fake, but, like, register a nonprofit that's, like, a religious organization just to ordain all the women who should have been ordained but never got to be ordained doing shit like that, you know what I mean? Because
mhm.
their denominations wouldn't ordain women or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, it's really yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you
Well,
100%.
and the it's the I yes, there's the female leadership part, and yes, she's, like, owning a role, that already existed in the church, but the way the film emphasizes the way she girl bossed it,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
there's, like
Yeah, because, like, it's scene after scene of her just, like, telling a guy what's what. What's another movie? There's that movie where there's, like Queen's Gambit. It's
mhm,
just basically the whole movie is her just, like, owning men at chess, and this is Cabrini, like, owning men at, like, their own game, like, politics or whatever it
yeah.
is.
And the kinds of, the owning, or the energy she had was, uh, so driven by the needs of the community that, um, that oftentimes that kind of forceful insistence, in films that will celebrate someone, right, like,
Yeah,
going boss mode
yeah,
is like, "Oh, I'm conquering something for business," or, "I'm
yeah,
conquering the other in war,"
yeah,
or there's, like, the family like, take Succession, right? Like, where all these people are trying to, it's a battle for who's gonna be the big baddie boss
yeah.
of the future.
Oh, yeah.
Um, that 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 it's that kind of energy and tenacity, but she's standing in for the voices and bodies that don't have access to the conversations,
Yeah,
that can create, kind of
yeah,
all these kind of different centers of support in the community, from like education and tending to the kids, orphanages,
yeah,
hospitals, and even like thinking through about how to literally build them in ways, that, um that is like tending towards the other. That is just like we don't usually have boss stories for the other unless there's a
Yeah.
dog in the movie. Then
Yeah. That's the exception. There's a scene towards the end where she's like she's she has to go back to Italy for a while because she gets in trouble for trying to build a hospital, and then she comes back and she's, like, got the money to do the project, and the archdiocese is like, "You can do this, but you have poked the hornet's nest." I'm like, "She's trying to build an acting hospital." Like, "Oh boy, you are going to upset the powers that be." And
Mhm.
you think about what she's actually trying to do. She's not trying to, like, steal anything. She's not trying to take over somebody's business or anything. She's just wanting to build a hospital, and they're like, "Oh boy." Like, but I guess, that's the world. That's the world we live in, right?
Well, and, we the one of the other films that, comes to mind, though I'm in doubt it gets to that kind of status, but, like, in, like, The Mission, part of what you see is that kind of conflict of power, right, where the political and religious power structures don't have space for the, uh, voices in the church whose deepest identity are with the underside. Um, be it like, the switching of what land is whose in The Mission, in the film, The Mission, and
Right.
then how it relates to the different indigenous populations and then in these kind of things. The here, it 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 gets felt different because while it while it is far enough in the past, we may not yeah, like the particular cultural lines of America in the present aren't there. That kind of energy is. If you're in religious spaces, there are all sorts of times. Um, the logical thing to do or the making peace and slow modification type of response, where the wise elders are explaining away, um, the desire to do something beautiful happens. And I think that, um, the the kind of the cooperative institutional resistance to community flourishing that she runs into is something, plenty of people will resonate with, in the present who have those same kind of questions arising from their encounters, in the world and going like, "Well, like, why? Like, somebody's making a decision not to address this." And when you see so many of the people who have the dials of power, resisting it and then telling her a story that this is just not how things are done, um, I think that, uh, while the role of religion in America is not the same, that kind of the institutional powers of culture, want us to be okay with crumbs, and that, like, in that way, regardless of whether one identifies with her religious tradition, the way it inspired her to feel called to action in a sense by her neighbors, is I mean, that part that's very compelling, and I
Yeah.
thought the actress did a really good job, uh, w doing it because, that is a it's easy to overdo it.
Yes. Yes. I wish they would have given a little more, depth to Cabrini in terms of, um, I don't know, just a little bit more about her history or what she was going on there's, like, one point where she has a conversation with you know, the the woman who was the prostitute, and they
Mhm.
get a little bit into her psychology and stuff. They don't really use the other nuns at all. Like, she arrives with 6 nuns, and they don't really have any sort of role. But, yeah, I would have liked to kinda, like, get to know her a little bit more deeply, um, and in a more, like, nuanced way, like, did she ever feel conflict or whatever? Um, but but yeah, I did think the actress portraying that did that in a good way. The thing that I did like about the film and what I liked that it made me think about was the fact that I read, like, a fact checky article about this movie already, and, like, the doctors did tell her she had, like, 2 years to live multiple times,
Mhm.
and she lived for, like, 25, like, she lived to be 67 or something,
Mhm.
so like, in her late 30s that they told her that, and she lived to be 67, and that the film does get that in there, that theme of, like, she feels like her other option is to die, and as long as she's serving what she knows is her purpose and, and doesn't stop and, like, keeps going, she
Mhm.
knows she will live, and, like, she has moments they kind of suggest that she's like, "Well, maybe I'll just die instead," you know? Um, but and that is true, like, there's multiple stories like that where people have that diagnosis or prognosis, and then as long as they feel they have a purpose in life, they outlive it by, many years, which is just incredible. And yeah, and it was true. It
Mhm.
was true, so really
Yeah,
beautiful.
yeah, I asked a friend of mine who's a historian about it, and, she said she was surprised at how well the film did,
It
given,
a lot of it was
given the people
historical.
given the
Yeah.
people behind it, and I was like,
Yes.
"Cool, well, did you write anything about this?" And she was like, "Well, no,
Yeah.
I really wouldn't wanna support it." And I'm like, "Well, this is like,
Yeah.
it's considering,
Yeah.
the last big movie they did, um, I
Yeah.
like that it was
Obviously, I
much
didn't
more
see that.
historically accurate, it might be a good thing, and
I
I think it'd be
yeah.
hard to get, QAnon references uh, into it.
Yeah, I don't know, I was trying to dig into that a little bit because, like, Sound of Freedom, it's not just like, oh, it's a conservative director who's, like, a known conservative, but it's, like, it's a whole lineup of known conservatives who symbolize, like, these extreme right positions and maybe, yeah, some QAnon affiliation. I don't know that the director is, like, into QAnon. Like, I know that well, do you know?
No, I don't think he is. I think
I don't think
the message boards
the
made it
people
like
who like the movie
yeah,
are
yeah, yeah.
so I have some friends.
Which
Yeah,
I talked to a f not the main person, but someone associated with it who said, yeah, they like, the filmmaker was frustrated at how it got received culturally,
right.
and then how it played that.
I
Now,
read that
if
his
it inspires those individuals to buy a whole theater seat of tickets for no one to watch it, I wouldn't complain too much. Like, I'm not if fundamentalists want to become homebrewed Christianity members and donate every month, and,
I
you
could
like,
argue
and not listen, I'm
that.
fine, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I read that the director's father and brother had been kidnapped and murdered, and that he was passionate about, like, the issue of human trafficking, and I reminded me, like, I was thinking of so when I watched Cabrini, I was like, maybe I'm just gonna pretend like a progressive woman made this movie and see if that I could play that out because obviously biases, like, play into how you
Yeah,
watch something, you know? I didn't see Sound of Freedom, but I know I have these friends, the Tao brothers, they're twin brothers, but they're film directors, and they were take commissioned by a nonprofit to make a short film around the theme of human trafficking, and they're incredibly talented directors, like, they're very, very artistic, very professional, beautiful cinematography. Their team at the time was really discouraging them from doing it. They're like, you can't make a movie about human trafficking and it not be read as, "Oh, you're QAnon people now."
yeah. Which
And
you kinda wanna know, like, who's a human that's for human trafficking, right?
it
Like, I don't think that's that complicated. It's, uh
so that's our politicized, like, climate right now, I guess, and they're like, their Hollywood team is like, "You cannot do this." They ended up deciding to do it, and it won a bunch of awards, like, it's
mhm,
called The Rabbit Hole, and was, like, Vimeo staff picked, and it won, like, a bunch of awards, and it's very, like, tastefully done. I'd be willing to venture it's better than Sound of Freedom. I don't know if they any QAnon people being like, "Oh, this is the best short film of the year." Um, but it's just interesting how those things play into this. Like, the only time I got, like, that kind of, overt, like, faith-based vibe was at the very end over the credits, there's, like, this voiceover, where it's, like, telling you
yeah.
the message of the film. Oh, geez, if you didn't get it already,
If you
like
didn't get it, um though, as someone who's realized 2/3 of the way through their sermon that what they thought was going to land didn't, sometimes
sometimes you do
you
need
just
it,
like,
right?
you're like, "Now just to clarify, here's what I was going for." Um,
Yeah.
well, you mentioned, before we started recording, like, even, like, the different kinds of reactions the film has generated.
Yeah. I had pulled up, like, an article from Variety where, they reviewed it. I actually maybe will quote this person, and this is a obviously, yeah, so the headline is, "Lifeless religious drama chronicles hardships faced by determined Italian nun who fought for immigrants." Um, and at one point this, let
It's a
me
very
quote
tweetable title.
yeah, so this is how this author saw it. It's as if Monteverdi that's the director. It's as if Monteverdi aims to appeal to the fringe political spectrum in this country by portraying himself and his work as as examples of what good immigrants in quote can do when they reject progressive ideals and align themselves with fascism based on religious affinity. And I mean, you don't get that from watching Cabrini.
No,
You
and
have
I'm, like,
to.
against aligning faith and fascism
Yeah, me too.
quite significantly. Um, y
Yeah. Yeah, so and
but
then
that kind of like, that's actually, like, a good example, I think, of how, an increasing number of more conservative Christians feel, like, alienated and ostracized in kind of, like, dominant culture,
mhm,
where a film about a nun like, I think she only prays once in the film, and it's
mhm.
before a meal. She's a nun, you don't see her rocking the rosary, and all these kind of features that are a part of Catholic life. Like, if you compare it to Romero, one of my favorite movies of all time, but, like, Romero's being very Romero. Like, it's the only sermon you see in Romero isn't just the one where he's assassinated, by people we trained as Americans, uh, but it runs throughout. Like, his faith, you get to see both the conflict, like in this movie with the religious and political aristocracy and such, but also you see, like, how, uh, Bible studies in base communities showed up, and, like, there are
Yeah,
all these features
yeah.
of his Catholicness as
Mhm.
he experienced his own faith that were a part of it. And this one, it I mean, it's kinda a deliberate choice, right, to, show the material life of a saint without exploring the internal life that generates it.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem like a conscious choice because, yeah, the like, Jesus. Someone did point out that Jesus was not even named, I don't think even once. At one point, she was like, "We can do all things," and it was like, oh, she's gonna quote that Bible verse. But even that is, like, sort of said as just, like, a normal line of dialogue. Like, it's very her relationship with even the Variety article pointed it out, like, you don't even and he was kinda mad that they didn't flesh her character out with more depth or more about her childhood and all that kind of stuff too, but he's like, "They didn't even explore her relationship with God." Uh,
Well, you kinda wonder, like, would you have then added a whole paragraph to your review where you see her praying to someone who was
exactly. Oh,
crucified by the empire, but it's secretly being leveraged to baptize fascism, and you're like, and this isn't even like what's fascinating to me is the because those pushing back to what she wanted to do
mhm.
were, in different parts of the civic order, both like, yes, there's the conflicts and stuff within the Catholic Church.
John Lithgow as the
Yeah,
evil mayor.
yeah, but, like, you also get political
Uh-huh.
pushback,
Mhm.
and the threads that bind the different people resisting her work are really their attachment to power and privilege.
Yeah,
Like, that's identified as the problem,
yeah,
which you would think, um, is, uh it's, like, anti-fascistic, right? Like,
yeah,
and it's not something, if you're progressive, you would roll your eyes at. It's like Bernie Sanders' stump speech is how, the structures of power are more concerned with preserving it, harnessing it, and justifying, as natural and required, the
mhm,
privilege, that
mhm.
we that's already there. So, like, the I got more irritated looking at how progressive people treated the film,
Mhm.
looking for stuff under a corner,
Yeah,
or projecting it, than it was almost it was annoying in a different way than watching how conservative people. I watched a number of, reviews from conservative Christians who like the fact that she only prays once and you don't get all this, and they're like, it's taking God out of the blah 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 blah, and it's like one of them said, this is just like taking God out of schools, and I'm like,
Oh
one,
my
God, you didn't take God out of school. We stopped using the power of the state to force everyone to pray in a particular way because freedom
yeah.
and liberty of conscience is an essential element for genuine responsiveness to the divine and the way it seizes you. But nonetheless, I get your point, right? But the like, I think it may make it. You, you could make a sense that as irritated as the I want to find a religious problem with it and
Mhm.
response you see temple exemplified in the Variety article and conservative Catholic bloggers talking about it. Um, it they both, I think, reveal exactly how compelling um, her life is and why it's a saint. Why would she be sainted? Is because she was actually committed to the material life of all the people around her, namely the ones Jesus said, "Well, how you do unto them, you'll do unto me." Do you need her to quote a Bible verse or and then all of a sudden it's more compelling?
Yeah.
Or are human beings structured in a way when someone is deeply invested in caring for the needs of others,
Mhm.
transgressing the boundaries of culture
Yeah.
that everyone wants to instantiate as final in the world, all those kinds of
Yeah.
things. Like it is they what is compelling both about her personhood and about her faith is what it looks like in action. And I think that kind of inscribing people of faith into a narrative where you can dismiss them and that progressive people that aren't familiar with the texture of faith too often do. And insisting that what you really need the saint to say are the ideas you believe are true because you aren't going to actually do what they're doing. But both of those are dismissing what's so compelling about her life. Even
Yeah.
though if she was here and we had a theology conversation, I imagine we'd have significant disagreements in all sorts of ways. But if you ask, like, was she faithful in her context and space? You're like saying no um,
Yeah.
is kind of offensive especially if you aren't like, already on the trajectory of potential being, like potential sainthood. Like, anyway,
Yeah.
I,
It sounds like you
sorry.
got fired up about it, Trip.
No, I just got irritated. I would like, and one
Yeah.
of it, I had a couple. I mentioned a couple friends about watching it.
Yeah.
Would they watch it and what they thought? And then a couple of them that were Catholic sent me these videos, and I'm just sitting there going, if I was a Catholic priest, I would not get on and make a video about this film and be like, I'm just so disappointed there wasn't God in it. When the entire point of the mass, right, is like the actual presence of God in the community and being sent out, having been nourished at the table to what embody, materialize God in the world, like the whole
Mhm.
flow of it.
Mhm.
Like, why do you organize your church in parish methods? Namely, so that the community itself, not driving and being a consumer religion across town, that your actual neighbors, the
Yeah.
people you live with, are all invited to that very same table in that place. And what are you called to do? To like embody the presence of God there. Well,
Yeah.
if that it that kind of enactment makes a lot of the ideas that animate it plausible in
Yeah.
ways that just repeating them and then doing the crap that makes more progressive people like, is this a cover for fascism? Doesn't. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that kind of critique that's coming, like, from the, uh, more p the liberal side of things, the left side of things, um, it gives permission to, uh, I don't know, it's just more of an energy and a culture of othering that is
Mhm.
also not helpful to the culture, you know what I mean? Um, instead of, like, perspective taking and it's aligning with my tribe instead of, uh, creating that connective tissue that we need to, like, create the kind of world that Jesus was talking about. It's like when people critique too, like like understanding that this filmmaker, he might have his political views, but he's still a person, and he's still a film and just kind of doing some of that empathic, like, perspective taking work is kind of what we need more of, not more of whose side are you on? What agenda are it's definitely not a straight up propaganda film. You couldn't even try to say that. So,
Mhm.
um, so yeah, I hear you, and that's an exercise I was trying to not participate in.
And this time period, uh,
I know when people get mad about social gospel too, or like the social gospel movement,
yeah,
as if Jesus was promoting a anti-social gospel, like some other gospel that didn't change how we operated in the world, you know?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Um, I think timeline wise, she is active at the same time. John Ryan, the Catholic social, I mean, he was the social gospel voice, right, for
mhm,
Catholicism.
mhm,
Um, is also active and addressing specifically, right, like the way income disparity and social needs are not being met, both by inherited things like the results, aftermath of slavery, Reconstruction type stuff, and um, is looking. He named specifically the way immigration was giving social license to narrow the space of ethical valuation. It and he was actually the pioneer of arguing for the living wage. I mean, that was the title of one of his books, right? So, like when you think of her, I mean, you even mentioned like, oh, well, some of the other nuns don't that are there don't get a story and stuff. Like, but in that biopic focusing on her, she's also part of a larger movement in the Catholic Church at that time that recognized the natural law, moral tradition of Catholicism,
mhm.
where like it, no one has to be anything other than human to exist as an ethical demand for you if you are a Christian. They bear the image of God, and whatever the other details are, do not impact the
Yeah,
obligation you have to care for them. And that kind of care is something that should be expressed not just in your own charity towards others, but you're to advocate and seek a collective response to it in the life of the church and in the life of your city, town, state structure. And so, for him, that led to articulating a living wage, and dealing with it at the economic level. But that ethical impulse of how the Catholic tradition, as a church, right? Unlike a lot of the Protestants that you have like, oh well, the Norwegians, they tended to be Lutheran and they're over here, and the Baptists get located down here and they come from here. And
mhm,
Protestantism came with a kind of ethnic uh, background, right? So, like, even in that time in New York, Baptists that were German had their own German language churches, and then there were English
mm,
language churches, and they
mhm,
weren't always friends with each other, right? And so,
mhm,
like, Protestantism becomes because they come out of nation states with particular heritages, they didn't ask the immigration question in the same way the Catholic tradition did, because, well, a lot of them all worshipped in the same language, even if they didn't understand it. They were a part of systems where you were moved around and interacted in different ways, and
mhm,
the church you prayed with and for all the time, and the pope that invites you into deeper faithfulness is like is a church that is already intimately connected with people across these kind of ethnic boundaries that are there. So it's not surprising that both in kind of like the macro area, people like John Ryan and the way the Catholic movement in the social gospel press this, and then and then on the ground, right, in what you see in her own story, is showing that yeah, like when you're when your deepest values are ones that come from a place where the divisions and distinctions culture um, prioritizes, then you come into conflict. And so, like, yeah,
yeah,
to me that the like that's something that is being celebrated and pushed forward in the film. That it's not like you don't know a nun is Catholic, but if you told a parallel story at that time, it is surprising how ethnocentric different Protestantisms were, because like the people at your church and the people in your denomination network aren't even just a that particular Protestant tradition. They're that particular Protestant tradition from a particular nation state in Europe, and your web of connection is that. Anyway, so like that historical element, I hadn't thought of till my church historian
yeah.
friend was like, yeah,
Uh,
this is one of the unique contributions that the Irish and then Italian waves of immigrants, uh, the Catholic tradition invited um, the moral imagination of Christians in America to
yeah.
expand in ways that Protestants, because of their ethnic centeredness, weren't at the front of.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. I'm sort of thinking about, like, how to bring that into now because we have this really fragmented culture now, and to the thing you said at kind of the beginning of that, of what you were just talking about, like, kind of the primary thing, like, you're made in the image of God, so I'm supposed to love and serve you, and that's all I need to know about you, really. Whereas now we have this very self-conscious culture, and it takes it I mean, maybe, it's taken different forms throughout history, but you have to first be really grounded in yourself. Like, you have to be a have a good sense of strong sense of self, and then you have to be like, "Okay, whatever you throw at me doesn't change this thing I know about you." It takes, like, a concerted effort, I feel like, to not other people right now or not be like, "Okay, how can I identify that you're part of my tribe?" As part of, Dan, our mutual friend Dan from the You Have Permission podcast, and I did this grant about intellectual humility, the science of intellectual humility and humility in general. And there was an episode we did, if people want to check it out, it's called Other People Are Different and That Makes Us Anxious. Like on a, kind of like an evolutionary level, it makes us anxious when people are different. And we had a psychologist on, we talked about that and how to have sort of intellectual humility about other people and what they might have to teach us and, right sizing yourself in those interactions and stuff. So that's what makes me think about.
Mhm. Well, yeah, so I mean, do you have any final thoughts about it? Like, other than, I mean, I would say
Well, I
the
love that Cabrini is on display in New York and that you could go visit her wax body. Like, so, it's pretty wild. They dug up her bones or her whatever remains and there's I didn't know there's Catholic mummification processes. And then they encased the remains in a wax replica of her and you can go visit it. I'm now gonna do next time in New York. Honestly, I'm gonna do it.
yeah. Now, yeah, and the, maybe, uh, thinking about what can and can't happen when doing biopics, like, are there any kind of observations about that come to mind? Um, because the the kind of examples where kind of tribal identity have these a prioris for what you're expecting in a biopic. And I definitely had some going in and tried to, have cognitive empathy and was like, "Oh, yeah, well, this is nice." But she was a figure I didn't know a lot about,
Yeah.
and I could imagine.
First American saint because she,
Yeah,
became an American citizen, in 1908 or something. Um,
yeah. I'm just, like, what do you think about
mhm,
the function of doing these kinds of biopics? Uh,
yeah. You can't you can't get a whole life into a movie, really.
mhm,
You have to choose what you're gonna highlight about that life and take that highlighter throughout their life and choose what you're gonna include and not include. So there's always, that redaction process when you're preparing to make a movie like this. Uh, One movie I'll just mention because to just keep my indie cred up while I'm recording an interview about Cabrini, is the movie Poor Things,
mhm.
which was, my favorite of this Oscar season. I highly recommend. It's a you learn this pretty early in the film, but it's a grown woman's body, but she has the mind of a baby, the brain of a baby. And so even though she's Emma Stone the whole time, in the beginning of the film, she has the mannerisms of a baby, of a child, and then becomes like a fully formed adult woman by the end of the movie. And it does that in a very fantastical kind of way. Um yeah, and definitely, it's just a very unique form of biopic, but for not a real person, so it's a little bit different. But anyway, with a film like this, I think if there is an agenda, it is to help people have more compassion and sympathy for immigrants and inspire, the kind of care for the orphan and the widow, uh, that Cabrini centered her life on. Now, is I wonder, this surely these filmmakers know they're making a movie for conservatives. Definitely, if anyone's more inclined to see this movie, it's gonna be a conservative, probably Christian person. And getting them to be softer on the immigration issue might be part of that agenda. Do I have a lot of faith that this movie will do this? Like, at the end of the movie, there's a QR code. I don't know if this is just for the screener maybe, or if it's in the actual like, for anybody. I don't know. But you can scan it and I guess send it the movie. I was like, "Oh, I wish this was something you could scan and donate to organizations that help immigrants." But no, it's like scan it and share the movie. But I don't know that it will move the needle on, I don't I wanna say as a filmmaker that, I wanna believe that stories like this will, like, move the needle for changing people's views, and I've heard of people changing their minds because of movies, but it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell.
Well, I would just say, like, that the kind of editing that's required in a biopic
Mhm.
should not be inherently offensive because we have 4 different gospels, and, almost none of them talk about anything outside of 3 years max of Jesus's own life, and I'm guessing
It
those people would count them as, compelling. I mean, they're bestsellers consistently.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. There's nothing wrong with some good editing/redaction. I think that that's just part of life. That's how we communicate.
Mhm. Well, there you go.
I
Well,
also one last thing. The thing that's always badass about nuns, it's, like, been the long-term, um, strategy for women who don't wanna get married to become nuns. And it's, like, like, for all of history, not all of history, for a long, long time, it was, like, maybe the only option for women who were like, "Being married seems awful." I don't wanna do it. I'm not saying that's the only reason people became nuns, but it's sort of a cool strategy, honestly. If you're in that kind of situation.
there you go. Well, thank you for hanging out, Sari.
Thanks for inviting me, Trip. This was fun.
Alright.